Welcome back to the shop and to the channel. Something a little bit different this week. I was contacted by the folks at Sterlingkit, and they asked me if I'd be interested in one of their model steam engine kits. And of course, I said yes. I've seen these before on some other channels, but I have always been intrigued by steam engines in general, and watching channels like Quinn over at Blondie Hacks Machine, some PM research kits, fascinated me. But at the same time, I don't know that I have the skill and patience just yet to put together a kit like that. And so when Sterlingkit offered to send me one of theirs, I jumped at it. So this kit comes with all the components that you need, not just for the steam engine, but it also includes a boiler so you can power it with actual steam. It's mostly unassembled. There are a couple of components that they pre-assembled for me in the kit, but the rest of it I have to do myself. It came with all the tools that I would need, although I did end up using a different pair of tweezers. I needed some Loctite for a couple of fasteners, and of course you need some distilled water and some denatured alcohol for the fuel. It comes with all of the hardware as well. It's all pretty small. Some of it is extremely small. It's separated into about 12 bags. And it is fairly well labeled in the instructions where to get the different components from, which bag to take it from, or at least which collection of parts to take it from. So it's not too bad. There were a couple of things that I goofed up on, but was able to eventually figure out I had used the wrong fasteners and swap them out. Now, if you're interested in getting one of these kits, they're not cheap. I think the retail on it is $399. But if you use the affiliate links in the description and use the coupon code, you can get a 15% discount. And, the channel gets a little bit something in return. It's not much, so if you decide not to do that, it's not going to break my heart. But I did want to make sure you were aware that you could get this for a little bit less if you choose to do that. I want to finish pulling all of the components and parts out of the box, lay them out so I can see what's what. Yeah, here's one of those components that's pre-assembled, the crankshaft. This doesn't look like it would have been too bad. Maybe they did it just to make sure things were balanced right. But let me get everything out of the box and kind of organized, and I can start putting it together. The instruction booklet does go through an explanation of everything, and some of the stuff that you'll need to provide. It has diagrams of all the parts, packaging, and where they're at. This gets referenced also throughout the assembly instructions. They reference, what the part number is, and based on that part number, you can find that in the illustrations, and then that'll tell you what bag that particular part is located in. So it's not too bad to figure out. I will say the single most difficult thing that I had to do was figure out exactly which fasteners to use where. One of the bags had like 5 or 6 different sizes, and they were marked, but often it wasn't extremely clear as to which one was which, right? I was using a metric scale and measuring the length of the fasteners, but there were sometimes multiple styles of fasteners with the same length in the bag, so had to kind of figure out which one was which. I did make one error with the fasteners that mounted to the underside of the cylinder. But I ultimately figured that out, and it was fairly easy to swap it out with the correct ones. Well, I didn't realize just how bad my camera was focused here, so you can't really see what in the heck I'm doing, but here I'm just attaching the bearings to the motor base here with the crankshaft slid in. We'll move on to the next step here rather than continue with blurry footage. Well, I'm hoping that this camera angle will be a little bit better and maybe keep things in focus. So here it goes. The next step here was to assemble the piston. There's an O-ring that goes around the piston, and then it gets fastened to the piston rod, and this is where you need to use a little bit of Loctite. And I screwed up here. I put the screw in the wrong side of the piston, which I should have figured this out because part of the instructions tell you exactly how long this whole assembly is supposed to be, and it was measuring longer, and I just kind of said, oh, well, maybe the dimensions are wrong in the instructions. They're not. I was ultimately able to figure out that I made a mistake and fix it, so it wasn't totally catastrophic. And there are a lot of small parts to keep track of, including these little E-clips. They do give you one extra in a spare parts bag, so that's good. Lucky for me, I didn't lose anything, although I almost did. I did happen to drop one of the E-clips on the shop floor. Luckily, my shop floor wasn't such a disaster that I wasn't able to find it, but it was small enough that there was a good chance I could have missed it. So here I'm measuring this whole assembly, and I'm coming up about 3.5 millimeters or so longer than what it's supposed to be. I think it's supposed to be 40.5 or something like that, and I'm coming up with 44. And I'm thinking maybe it's just a misprint, but it wasn't. The instructions do tell you, from time to time that you need to apply some oil in a few spots, and I'm just using some general gear oil that I use on the lathe. It's a non-detergent, lightweight gear oil, and this should work fine. A couple of things to note on this assembly is there's a gasket that is in between some of these parts, and you need to make sure that it is aligned right, otherwise you end up blocking the exhaust port. And the other thing was which fasteners to use to tie this all together. It actually took me a minute to figure this out, and then I chose wrong anyway. And it's because the diagram for this in the instructions is not super clear as to which fasteners to use, but that's mostly my fault because it is clear. I just didn't see it. The numbers for the fastener are in circles. They're little circles in the diagram, and it was so close to the illustration of the steam engine that they kind of blended together, and I really didn't see them right away. So the fasteners for this are in this bag 12, and this is the one that has a bunch of different sizes. So what I ended up doing was grabbing this plastic container and dumping them in here so I could sort them by like fastener, and the count of each one would at least help me deduce which fastener was which, or at least help. These are all the parts for the reversing lever, and being that they're all in the same bag, it was nice and easy to put this piece together. Well, the next thing I can do is connect this cylinder block and the support to the base, as well as putting the pin in between the bottom of the piston and the crankshaft. I need to put these little E-clips on the end of the pin that attaches the crank rod to the bottom side of the piston. These are pretty small. I did grab another tool, which, just a pair of needle nose pliers to make this a little bit easier. The tweezers weren't going to clip that in there far enough. And this is, when I realized that I put the piston together wrong. I lined up the connecting rod with the bottom of the piston and realized that the piston came up out of the cylinder way too far. So I did have to partially disassemble this in order to fix my earlier mistake. The bracket for the reversing lever mounts to the side of the cylinder block support. With the pin now in the connecting rod, I can put the other E-clip on the other side. This stuff here that was pre-assembled on the crankshaft is part of the valve gear, the valve train, and there's a loose shaft. This connects to the end of the reversing lever. The next thing the instructions call for is the installation of the valve. This is kind of an interesting, mechanical setup. I am no expert on steam engines, to say the least, so I don't want to try to explain how these valves work. I understand it, but trying to explain it is just something that I'm not really equipped to do. But it gets connected to the crankshaft and controls which side of the piston the steam goes to. It some more fiddly bits, and some of this is pre-assembled for me, so it's not too terrible. Just got to make sure things are clean and lined up. So this piece here with the valve rod and the valve body, all this is pre-assembled. I'm using one of the Allen key wrenches that came with the kit to line up the holes for the cylinder head and the gasket and everything to make it a little bit easier to insert and install the fasteners. This part here was a little bit tricky. Where that valve rod comes down and intersects with that curved slot in part of the valve gear is a little roller, and that roller's held in place with a screw. But getting that roller inside the yoke and then lined up and getting a screw through it, that was a little bit tricky. Just took a little bit of patience to get that lined up right. Hopefully I don't drop this on the floor because I don't think there's a spare for this. The next thing to install here is the intake and the exhaust. The exhaust is fairly simple. It's just a copper tube and a flange. The intake, the tube and flange are pre-assembled, but it goes through a canister that's designed to be, contain some steam oil, and that helps lubricate the engine while it's in operation. The intake side is under pressure, so there's a gasket that goes on the flange here, between the flange and the valve. The exhaust attaches to the side of the cylinder head. Um, the holes in the flange were a little bit tight, so I had to kind of screw the screws through it. Um, I'm assuming these are the correct fasteners because they did thread into the cylinder head. And I'm aiming the exhaust a little bit down so any water that's in it will drain out of it. Now, the instructions say that the flywheel gets mounted on the outside of the engine, on the side where the valve gear's at. But that just didn't make any sense to me because there's a flat on the end of the shaft for the set screw. At least I presume it's for the set screw. And where I would tighten that down is a considerable distance away from the bearing, and even so, the washer that goes in between the flywheel and the bearing. So I don't know if these were, assembled differently. Maybe the shaft was made wrong. I don't know. But in any case, I did install it on the outside, but later I actually switched it up and mounted it on the inside because I felt like it made more sense for it to be there. And then there's this cover that goes on the bottom underneath the crank. The last thing is to attach this placard to the side of the base that says Rocking Whale on it. I guess that's the name of this engine. And this is about as fiddly as the fiddly bits get because it's attached with 4 screws. These are M 0.8 by 1.5 millimeter, although I think the 1.5 millimeter is generous. It might be even smaller than that. I ended up setting these on a clean shop towel because I was afraid that I was going to drop one and it was going to bounce and roll off my bench onto my shop floor and I would never find it again. The tweezers that came with this kit were not fine enough for what I needed here, so I do have a very fine set, sharp tipped tweezers to line this up. And what you can't see off camera is I'm wearing an optivisor with the maximum magnification set. And even then, this was a challenge to see. I am using the screwdriver that came with the kit, though. Now I can turn my attention to the boiler now that the engine is completely assembled. And first is this little escutcheon that goes on the top of the boiler shell for the chimney. The boiler itself mounts just to the front of this shell with a couple of screws. This machined fitting that's on the edge of the boiler for the sight glass has a groove where this O-ring will fit down into it. And then I can drop on the sight glass. This is an actual piece of glass. It is not like an acrylic or anything like that. I'm pretty sure it's glass. A gasket, and then the cover. There are 10 screws that go around this cover, and the instructions are pretty clear about not tightening up any one of them too tightly at first because you could potentially crack the glass. The next is this pressure gauge that connects with a couple of washers and a banjo bolt. The other hole just gets plugged. Now, I had a hard time getting this screw started in this side of the boiler in this plug. It would not go in. And I contemplated what I was going to do here. And ultimately, what I ended up doing was retapping this hole. It's 5mm, but it's a fine pitch, and I did not have any fine pitch 5mm taps. So I ended up tapping it for the common pitch. I can't remember what that is off the top of my head. And then replaced this brass screw with just a regular 5mm screw that I had in my parts bin, because it was just getting really tight. And honestly, I was worried more about stripping it and making the boiler unusable than I was about, retapping this hole. Well, next is assembling the safety valve and installing it. And what I mean by assembling, it's putting an O-ring around the safety valve. And for whatever reason, this fought me. This was actually more difficult than I was expecting it to be. I eventually got it on, but it was a little bit more challenging to get this little tiny O-ring over the threads of the safety valve than I would have expected. The valve goes in the other threaded fitting. And first is a jam nut, and then the O-ring goes on. The jam nut just makes it easier to line up the output of the valve in the direction you want it to go without having to tighten it all the way down. And then you tighten down the jam nut to seal the connection between the valve and the boiler. There's a little door that mounts to the front here of the boiler shell, and unfortunately they put this little sticker right over the holes for where the hinge mounts. And so I had to use a razor blade. I was trying to peel it off to where I could reuse it, but it didn't survive. And here's yet another group of very small pieces. There are 8 screws and 8 nuts, 8 very small nuts that go on the back of these to attach this little door to the front of the boiler shell. I did expect this to actually be a little bit more challenging than what it ended up being. Because these things are so small, but even with my, fat fingers, I was able to get the nut on there and spin it enough to get it started. Mounting the other side of the hinges to the boiler shell was a little more challenging because there just wasn't a whole lot of room inside the boiler shell to fit my fingers in order to get the nuts on the back of those screws, but I eventually figured out a way to make it work. I'm putting the supply line on the valve for now. The chimney mounts over top of the supply line. I think the intention is for this to kind of act as a superheater. I don't know if it really does much, but I'm going to have to take this off again later in order to adjust the bends in that copper line to line up with the intake on the steam engine. Well, there's a little handle here that attaches to the front of the, I don't know what you want to call this, where the fuel, this is the burner itself. You put denatured alcohol in it. I wasn't real happy with how these fasteners were fitting in here. I may have chosen the wrong fasteners. I will admit that that's a possibility. So I ended up replacing these with some button head screws and nuts to go on the back rather than the fasteners that were provided in the kit. I'm sure that if I would have figured out the correct fasteners to use, that this would have been fine. Going back and looking at the instructions again, I could see where I may have made a mistake, but since this was easier for me, I suppose, than trying to figure out where I had made a mistake. So I have this collection of metric fasteners, and it's I use it for a bunch of stuff, but it came in handy at least today. I know I didn't need to do this. This just made it a little bit easier for me. Well, I'm down to the home stretch here. Getting ready to assemble this all together. First are these feet, these little rubber feet with some acorn nuts on the top to give it a nice look. There's some threaded holes here in the base for the boiler. And same for the steam engine. And here's where I'm kind of seeing that I'm going to have to make some adjustments to that supply pipe. And this is where I decided I was going to take the flywheel and move it to the inside. Because the shaft on that end is a lot shorter. And who knows, maybe someday I'll either get or machine a pulley and put it on the outboard side of this, and maybe we'll power something. I don't know what that would be, but you never know. Well, with the engine mounted, I can take the supply pipe off so I can bend it to the correct shape. With the chimney back on, that's it. The assembly of this is complete. Next thing is to fire it up, see if it runs. Well, before I fire this thing up, I want to make sure that it's got the right lubrication. So I've got some of that lightweight oil here that I'll use on the external components. And then I've got some of that 30 weight oil that I'm putting into this canister where the steam oil is supposed to be. I don't have a funnel that's small enough, so I'm using a syringe here to put about 50 milliliters of distilled water into the boiler. Put the safety valve back in and then make sure that the steam valve is all the way closed. I have some denatured alcohol as my fuel. I suppose you could use 99% isopropyl, but from what I've read, the denatured alcohol burns a lot cleaner and doesn't produce as much soot as a just a standard isopropyl alcohol. So I'll put about 30 milliliters of denatured alcohol into the burner. I'll light it here with a fireplace starter, grill starter. The flame of a denatured alcohol fuel is extremely transparent. You can't see it. So it's one of those things that I have to be cautious about, that I can't see the flame. That doesn't mean that it's not burning. It should only take maybe 5 or 10 minutes at most to get this thing up to operating pressure. So now we just sit back and wait. I'm not seeing any movement on the pressure gauge yet, so I'm checking the safety valve here just to see if there's any steam pressure. It's still warm, so I'm pretty confident that the burner is still lit. I can hear something happening inside the boiler. It sounds like, what you would expect to hear when water is boiling. And if I check the safety valve here a little bit, I'm getting some seepage, which tells me that the boiler is building some pressure, but I'm still not seeing anything on the pressure gauge. I am seeing some seepage underneath the pressure gauge, and I'm trying to tighten it, and I'm not having any luck getting it any tighter. It's not much of a leak, but it's a little bit of a leak. It's still not reading any pressure, but if I check the pressure relief valve, there's definitely steam pressure in the boiler. I think this thing might be ready to go. It must be a defective gauge. In spite of what's on the pressure gauge, I'm going to open up the steam valve and see if I can't get this thing to run. I'm going to try to kick it over here by hand. It's still a little bit stiff. There is some water coming out of the exhaust. I may have overfilled the oil canister, so I might need to do this by hand until it flushes all the way out. Oh, there we go. There it's running. A little slow, but that's okay. I don't need it to be taken off. Still no pressure on that pressure gauge. It's got to be bad. I am getting some leaks on the cylinder head. I can see some water up there. We'll try tightening up some of those screws here. I'll turn off the steam valve here so we can switch the reversing lever, and now it's going to be turning in the opposite direction. Well, this is really cool. I'm pretty excited about this, especially considering the only thing I had to do was assemble it. It took about 2.5, maybe 3 hours total to put this together over a couple of evenings. I am going to go around and tighten up some of these screws where I see some water seeping. Not overly critical, but it would be nice if it wasn't leaking, get the maximum power output. This thing is running really nicely, and everything seemed to be going perfectly. While I was, tightening up some of the screws here on the valve cover, if you listen really closely, you can hear the sight glass crack. I'm not exactly sure why it cracked, but it cracked. And it could have been maybe I tightened down those screws too tight originally, but I did end up contacting Sterlingkit, and they are sending out a new pressure gauge and a new sight glass. But at this point, I opted to go ahead and shut everything down just in case there was an issue with that thing being cracked. I didn't want to make anything go from bad to worse. Well, that part is a little bit disappointing, but it is what it is. Luckily, Sterlingkit will be sending me out a new sight glass, so I'm happy that they're going to do that. The pressure gauge thing, I would imagine I could probably go on Amazon and buy another pressure gauge. I'm sure these are probably pretty cheap, but again, they're sending out a replacement for me. Yeah, you can feel that there is a definite crack in that sight glass. That's a bit of a bummer because I wanted to play with this thing a little bit more. So I'll have to wait until that replacement gets here. But overall, I'm pretty happy with it. I'm pretty chuffed to have this. I think it is a bit of an inspiration here. Maybe I will look at getting one of those PM research kits, maybe one of the simpler ones. I don't want to go too crazy. I like the idea of having a boiler. I would imagine I could probably use this boiler for one of those PM research kits. We'll see. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and open up all the valves here, let this thing cool down, and drain it until I get the new parts. Overall, I'm pretty pleased with this kit. I think it went together pretty easily. I do think they could do a little bit of a better job of maybe separating out some of that hardware in different bags so that they're easier to identify. Maybe that's an improvement that they'll take into consideration. But overall, it was fairly straightforward, and I really had a lot of fun running it for at least the short time that I got to run it. And if this is something that you would like to try, again, there's some links down into the description that you can use to get one for yourself. Maybe make a nice Christmas present for somebody. Use the discount code, save a little bit of money. This isn't the usual video that you see on my channel, but this is something I really wanted to do, and that's what my channel really is about. It's about the things I do in my shop, and this just happened to be what I did this week. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up. Give me a comment. Let me know. Would you like to see more of these or none at all? In either case, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.